Okay, let's talk about community power. This is the next section. This I do have some semi-prepared, but the main point is we're now starting the second half of the course, and we can both talk about cases, examples, interesting new ideas such as a strong deviant case like the ousting of the Speaker of the House, and then you reinvented some of the core ideas which are the best around in this topic area. Same thing is true of power. Everybody talks about power all the time, in your family, in classes, this and that, and it's the usage is, I won't say worthless, but it's almost. That's why we have this section. In all of the sections, if you look, and I've done this in the past, if you look at textbooks on all kinds of topics, organizations, nation states, nation states, cities, classrooms, etc. They all use the term power, but there are then also a bunch of other things like influence, domination, board use term. So in terms of the readings, the first one is really Max Weber, Max Status and Party. So this says, here at least, how did generally Max Weber make his major contribution in the social sciences? He was responding and extending Marx. It's the major voice at that point in late 19th century Germany, Europe. Was Marx, and the sense more generally that there were one-factor theories. One was the economic, of which Marx was one. Another was race, very widespread, late 19th century Germany and Italy, major dominating forces. That there's northern Europe, northern Italians and southern Italians come from different racial backgrounds, and that's why they're different. That, of course, that got a lot of negative flack after 1933 or 1945, and so that dropped out of social science and in polite discussion. Earlier, historically, temperature, climate. The northern Europeans are different from the southern Europeans because if it's cold, you have to stay inside, and therefore people are more individualistic, whereas in southern Europe it's hot, and therefore the southern Europeans are more sociable. Okay, that was used for years. Okay, what Max Weber did in general in this context, let me ask a question again. Anybody want to guess? Having heard or thought a little bit about this yourself, maybe? How about the title, Class Status and Party? Hint, hint. Power is not one of those, it's all three. It suffuses and interpenetrates those three things. But is there any one of those which drives everything else, like race or material well-being? No. All of those can have some degree of interdependence, pushing the others in different directions. So if you're very high in status, you're the king, you have the power, say the power based, if you will, on the let's say, when I say power, and how about based on what? In England, the king is worth what? When England, the king was worth what in 1400 or 1200? How much was this in it? Was this in a constitution? No, England has no constitution. Never did. So what's the foundation of the legal system in England compared to France or Germany? Yeah, but that's getting more what I'm trying to get to. The idea of common law is that there's not a strict set of rules, whereas where and why is there something else in, say, France? Why is France different? Do you have common law in France?
No, there's natural law for the constitution, they get changed regularly.
Okay, but where does that in turn go back to culturally and historically? Why is the continent so different from England?
Because the constitution represents like the creation of that era of politics, in the sense like France went through like multiple regime changes, and this one is defined by its constitution.
Yes, but what's the one big one that differs between England and the continent?
Well, I have states of relevant monarchy.
Yeah, all right, but yes, but before that in turn, and what really is legally important in terms of the conception of also the cultural conception of many, is the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire dominated continental Europe. It had some people from some of the Roman legions, some of the Roman legions went up into England, but they really didn't get very far. They got beaten off, and so they really didn't dominate. They didn't build architecture. They didn't have water. You know, the classic signs of the Roman Empire of these water tunnels and elevated, and then plus the circular theaters, which you have all around in Italy, but also in Avignon and Aix-en-Provence and so forth. In southern France, parts of Spain, you've got these Roman legions there and their residue. And in terms of the legal structure, all these countries on the continent basically have structured lists of maybe hundreds and sometimes categories and subcategories which go back to the Romans. And so Durkheim, for instance, sensitive to Durkheim was trying to go beyond this, to say where did these come from? And so what he did was, and say, you talk about in some of the basic values. If you have basic values that people are violating, how can you tell it's a basic value? He said, why don't we look at the strength of the punishment in the French list of laws that you have to obey? And if you pay $2 or something like that, or if it's death, if you're executed for doing this, that's more important than if it's 5 years or 2 years or 7 years or whatever, like that. So that's a crude beginnings, relatively, at least the concept is pretty clear. The implementation was relatively good in the sense of being quantitatively measured long before they had any questionnaire surveys, or they didn't have other concepts of trying to extend markets, which economists would at least try to take the concept of a market and then where and how can we try to estimate it, which they've done. Amenities. Okay. So the other readings are some of the so-called classics in this area. The Linns, or let me we at least have a couple of non-American, well, whatever. We have the presence of France here. With let me add. The grand traditions. Now, I did a PhD on the emergence of the social sciences in France. So I started really with the late 19th century with Durkheim. Durkheim was the big man. But if you go back, there were other theories that Durkheim was fighting with. And one of them was a group that was around a Catholic abbey, and they in turn were linked with people that included Le Play, Frédéric Le Play. So Leplay, was a mining engineer, and he would travel around 1850, 1840, 1860. He'd go around he'd go to Norway and to Germany, go to southern Italy and so forth. And he would then talk about the mines, but then he'd talk about the people who worked in the mines and were in the villages there. And so he wrote these monographs that were some of the most interesting first early steps toward empirical description in a somewhat comparative framework. And so one of the comparative frameworks was, and which was salient, and so then a little bit later, the other Laplacists, the abbey who I'm referring to is called Henri de Tourville, Henry de Tourville, D-E-T-O-U-R-V-I-L-L-E. I won't bother to put it on the board. But Tourville codified a little bit more, and he took these monographs. So he said, you know, why is population declining in France, and why are we being taken over culturally and economically and historically by Germany first in the early 19th century, and now, he said, in the United States? They were worried about the French in 1890. You know, France is going to lose as a cultural tradition. And so they sent some emissaries to where to find out, Tourville. Before Tourville, there was Tocqueville. Okay, so Tocqueville and these academies we talked about, they sent two people to this city of Chicago. And why? What did they take back to France to transform French civilization? No small stuff. They wanted to catch up and supersede Germany and America, which was being too entrepreneurial. That was a term they used. Individualistic, active, in terms of creating new ideas and new foci, having more responsive citizens who could not just be peasants and passive, but who could become more active as citizens, and in a more active, in this case now, the late end of the 19th century, democracy. I mean, Tocqueville said, "What the hell is democracy? You know, we never had any of that." So by 1890, where did they come in Chicago to do these things, to revolt, to revolutionize France? I'll ask. He's an official, as you've heard. He's an official representative of the French national government, spreading around, and they have a fantastic network of people in the entire world. We're just one little piece of this, but you know, you go to Thailand, you go to Australia, you've got this French cultural attaché and cultural people. Where, I mean, the U.S. I'm saying this because the U.S. don't have a clue how to do this. I mean, you have other things happening, and so that now, and I'll put a footnote: Hollywood, television, music, rap, Lady Gaga, things like that. But that's not the Ministry of Culture. Even though I got something in the email yesterday from a group that was affiliated with the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts in Washington. It's a tiny little organization. Is a mini version of the French Ministry of Culture. Okay, they held a meeting last week, and they're holding more meetings of the major agencies with big budgets: education, health, welfare, hospitals, and so forth, in Washington. And they're going to link, and the idea is to add culture to all of these agencies in their budgets and their staff and their thinking and create. And so this is what we talked about. Well, actually, the mayor of Chicago, Daley 2, did this for a bit in requiring all the city agencies, police, fire, and so forth, to incorporate art. And so in Chicago, what do you got these guys, we got sticks we hit people over the head with. Art? How are we supposed to do this? What did they do? They went to the gangs, and they asked the gangs, since they're a Mexican gang, little village, said, how can we do something that's sort of art? So, oh, we put on these little rap shows. You know, we gangs, we fight against each other. And we fight by having later on websites, but they also beat each other over the head, shoot each other, kill each other. But they do this in ways which can be more personable, and it can be an actual, you can have two guys rapping against each other with two gangs, and so why don't we just, you're from the police, we'll have a policeman here between two gangs. And they did. Okay. And the policemen were so inarticulate and so bad at handling themselves. And so it in turn it reminds me, the talented people in France who go to the high when they get tested. I mean, in France they get tested on age 7 and 12 and 18. They used to give little kids in France in the old days, at least. I don't know what you may have. Let's ask next what you had. In the old days they'd give gold stars, silver stars, maybe blue stars or something, and you'd have 12 kids in a class or 20 in a class, and they'd have stars. Did you have any residue of that when you were in?
But like before primary school, like you have like 4 years of kindergarten here in France. But yeah, they still did it.
Still starting at what age?
3.
Age 3. Listen to that.
Yeah, and in the Netherlands, because my brother was born over there, they have to be in school starting at 2.
Age 2 in the okay, I never heard this before. These are fantastic. Okay, but I guess what troubles me is how does this fit with the Netherlands being lower than France, especially lower in terms of age. Did your brother refer to ranking like this as well in the Dutch schools?
No, but I mean it was like mandatory. We're living in Antwerp, so it's like Belgium, but they follow the Dutch system, and so there's that requirement where you have to be in school everything in Dutch, and it's a lot different the approach to the French because they start way younger, like a year represents a lot at that age. The approach is a bit different than just plain flat out teaching starting at the first day in school.
Okay, this is terrific. See, these are deviant cases from compared to the American looser system. However, I was going to say in Asia, I mean the Asians generally, China, Japan, Korea, they have lots of discipline from the family, so the Tiger Mom bestseller. Who's heard about the Tiger Mom? Tell us a few sentences. What's the Tiger Mom?
Well, I suppose it's a stereotype, which is rooted in reality to an extent, of East Asian parents, oftentimes mothers, who are very competitive about their child's upbringing and will try and control every aspect of the kid's life in order to prepare them for university and success.
Yes, I mean that's great. She, the author, is a Chinese born in Manila, the Philippines. I think she went to Harvard, and then went to law school, and then she worked on Wall Street for maybe 15, 20 years. She's now a professor of law at Yale, and she wrote this book. But she's very smart. She has zero social science background, but she's got a lot of intuition. Okay. She had a public debate between her and the president of Harvard when he's a very smart economist. The book came out maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Why does this matter now? What's power? The implicit idea is that if you're better educated and you pass exams and the content of these exams are strictly imposed, you'll do well and you'll deserve to be at the top. I was in a conference in Italy with the Italians who are trying to say we want to get rid of this kind of Roman law in the whole society. How can we do so? I mean, they were asking the same kinds of questions the French did in 1890. And they had about 60 of the top social scientists and psychologists, economists from all over Italy. And they had two foreigners, me and Michel Crozier, C-R-O-Z-I-E-R. And he wrote a brilliant book called The Organizational Dilemma, or The Organizational something or other. And we both said the same thing. Completely independently, came up independently. We didn't know what the other was saying, etc. But he said it in detail for France, and in terms of the style you begin to think when you're first on those exams is arrogance. Crozier pointed his finger and said, "Your problem and our problem in France is arrogance, and this undermines trust. It weakens trust." So, in contrast to Putnam's bowling alone isn't the problem. Is we don't have enough people joining the little churches. The history of the U.S. The Crozier's pointing of his finger is very different. He's pointing toward the exam system and the standardized national system of regimentation and regulation, which if people did well, then they would. And so I'll ask you, who aims? So if you started, make a note. 4 years of kindergarten in France if you want to move there, huh? When you get to, let's say, the high school level, and you want to then show you're really doing well, and you graduate from the top, they even choose and they rank the high schools and so forth. But when you finish a high school, the lycée, where would you go if you're near the top?
Or then you would go like to school again to prepare for another exam to get into like one of the public schools.
Okay, grandes écoles literally is translated as big school. Or what are maybe two of them that are major? Well, one more for civil service and business. Actually, I shouldn't say business. Civil service and engineering. Okay, the École Polytechnique. So the Polytechnic school is that one. And the one for a more traditional academic route is what?
At that age? I don't remember. I know there's l'ENA after, l'École Nationale d'Administration.
Okay, not yet. The ENA is for administration, the National School of Administration. But often you'll do that after doing the Polytechnique. So for President of France, so many of the top people like President Macron, he went to, actually I'm not sure if he went to Polytechnique, but he went to the ENA. But the more academic would go to the ENS, named.
École Normale Supérieure.
Okay, so the superior school has both arts and humanities and sciences. And so then they would do a series of degrees, etc. But basically, these things are regulated in these terms. Okay. So I'm saying, here's the structure. Here's Crozier's pointing a finger. How can you get rid of this? And he pointed his finger at arrogance, his blaming of it. And what did he? How could he say? How did Tourville answer the question? The same question, at the different answer in 1890 was what? When he was looking for the U.S. and coming to the U.S. and sending emissaries, and they might even come to Chicago. And if they came to Chicago, what might these French travelers and Japan, let's add in parentheses, Japan was doing a little bit the same thing. That is, they said, we've got to compete with these Europeans and the Americans, and we're going to have to revolutionize Japan. But we're going to do it politely, peacefully, thoughtfully, and we're going to send emissaries. And they did so. And they're very, very successful. So they created, so let's just use Japan and France simultaneously. What did the Japanese bring back, and what did the French bring back, or create? And I'll say let me start with the Japanese, just quickly and simply. Things that you know, Toyota, Nissan, Honda, these merchant organizations, these general, they sell cars, they make radios, they make televisions, they have, all kinds, that they are sort of a conglomerate, they saw this as something they wanted to do to outcompete the Westerners. So instead of having individual companies like Ford or Chevrolet or whatever, or Renault, they wanted to have it more of a conglomerate where they gave a fair amount of autonomy to these guys who were traditionally knights, swordsmen in Japan. Okay. What did the French learn when they came to Chicago? Did they do that? No, drastic. We don't have any gentlemen, knights in a feudal manner. What did they find in Chicago?
Arts and culture. The arts and culture.
That's the right direction, but specifically, what school? You got schools like that for France. There's a school like that for the U.S., but it's not hierarchical. What was it teaching? Let me add. Who is? I'm free associating enough in ways that this should link to you today. Several of you are majoring in economics. You're studying economics in Harris School. Some of you too. Who is one of the Nobel Prize winners in economics, who did so initially for measurement because he was an econometrician, and how can you measure errors? Sounds very trivial. Measurement error, and including such things, he then went on to be self-selection. And how does the labor market work? That is, try to understand the market, labor market. You have investors, you have producers, and you have a labor market. So I say, labor market is a label which is, I'll just say, it's not consumption. It's not consumers. He thought, in that sense, like a traditional economist. When he was in his 20s and 30s, when he was 30, I guess 30, 37, 38, he won the classic prize for being the most brilliant economist under 40, as did many of the guys here at Nobel Prizes here. But then when he got to 50 and 60, I had a research assistant who worked with me for several years. She got a PhD in sociology. She then married Heckman. Heckman now has his book, his office is filled with sociology books. He listened to his wife. They did research together. He made that he saw some things he couldn't get to work because they didn't fit the normal answers he was getting from his background. He now he thinks he's got some answers that are I'm only going to sketch a little bit, or maybe bring a bit more on later on, but he's also then worked in China. And he's worked in China, and the name of the university that they're creating, or a program, a section of the school, whatever, is the same thing that Tourville looked into in 1890. And the name of it is the University of Chicago Laboratory School. Anybody? And nobody graduated from there, I guess. No. Anybody? And most of you are not from Chicago. So you probably don't know anything about it. Does anybody know anything about the lab school here? A little bit. Tell us a little.
It's very expensive and it's pretty elite. So I know there's like a series of tests you have to take to get in. From my understanding, and it's either the children of very wealthy people or oftentimes the children of academics tend to comprise a good chunk of the student body.
If you were a narrow-minded materialist economist, you'd get an A. But you're dead wrong if you go online, and read what makes the lab school distinctive in the way they said, and they were founded from the beginning in 1890, and which makes them different now. And the answer is it's one of two of the leading American, and for some purposes, international schools to teach what is called progressive education. What's progressive education? At least most of you Americans, I don't know about that. Anybody? What's progressive education? Okay. The idea is to say, we want to do the opposite of what the French are doing. We don't want to give people stars. We don't want to say you've got to pass this exam. We don't want 4 years of kindergarten. We want to say, when you come in here, you can do whatever you want. You can choose. And let's talk at the beginning of the first class. What shall we do in class today? It's very, very student-oriented. It's the opposite of the classic French, Chinese, Asian system. And Heckman, with all of his background, and his, thinking, as a Nobel Prize level, how can we help the Chinese develop more Nobel Prize level economists or general education? He's not just dealing with economics, he's dealing with general education. And the answer is, the name is Thomas Dewey, D-E-W-E-Y. He was a professor here in philosophy. He was one of the so-called utilitarians. And he focused especially on education. He taught also at Columbia. But he there developed, in consultation with him, they said, how can we build a brilliant Labra school next to the University of Chicago? And he said, do this. And they did it. Okay, his ideas and the statements of which are there online, and you talk, while you're going to be here a little bit, learn more. Ask some kids who've been students there. Ask some parents what they hear as parents. What do they do as parents? Do they help them with their homework? Do they say, we want to get the right answer better than the next kid? The girl there, she's from Thailand and she's from Korea. You're from China. You've got to be number one. Okay, that is the Tiger Mom. The lab school is the total opposite. And I'll just mention, this was true in 1890 and true in 1990, but when you go today in the 2021st, I'm mentioning it because I'm so interested in your comment about the Dutch or the Belgians. Today, if you go to Denmark, the Danes are further than anybody else. They have no homework. And the students love to go to school. It's progressive education with, further than anybody else. Okay, so the same ideas are now debated and discussed out there. These illustrate, if we listen and take these, where and what is power? And where and how do these different actions, institutions, norms, how do they come together to create this? Okay, the answer is people so I'll affirm in terms of course here. There are four kinds of answers, four traditions. How do you study power? And I apologize for my handwriting, but it's better than mine putting it on the board, and it takes too much time. First one, traditional elitists like Pareto and Mosca, and the key concept in that top box is base resources. We can call them that. Call them such as money, or your father is a duke, or a count in an aristocratic system, or an elected official, and they know that if you're a member of the national parliament like that, then those are base resources. Positional means say you hold that position, so that you're a member of the national legislature in Italy or France, or okay. The third kinds of, what are the results? This is elites and their identity, and how these are resisted or assumed, and that is, what's the rationale for these? They are assumed to be powerful. That is, we don't have any empirical data that they did anything. We don't know what power means. We're imputing power to these people because they're a member of the House of Representatives. We take a House of Representatives in the U.S. today, sounds like pretty much, it doesn't mean what it was thought of being 2 years ago. Okay. Let me just push on to get a little further. So I mentioned the Linds, I mentioned the French studies. They had loose ideas as well conceptually. So with Hunter, we have at least a conceptualization that was more explicit. Even though his name doesn't begin with M, he said in a meeting, I could be called a Stalinist Marxist. Stalinist Marxist. And so for him, he used the term power, but he didn't articulate it there in that second line. It's called reputational. Reputational wasn't what he called it then. He just called it power. But later on, the next line was Robert Dahl, who you scanned a little bit. Dahl really critiqued Hunter in saying, you know, you're not studying power, you're just studying the reputation for having power. And how did he do it? They ask questions with a concentric kind of circle of sampling. So they would go to things like the city newspaper who would cover City Hall, or the leading clubs, and they would say, who are the most important people in Atlanta? This is Atlanta. This is one case study of these most people. Who are the most important people in Atlanta? And then you go to him. You talk to him or him. It's usually him. Then you talk to him and say, when you finish the interview, you say, who are the most important people in Atlanta after you? And then he would say, well, there's so-and-so and so-and-so. Then you go to the third. Okay, that's called sampling in this distinctive way. And then they would draw circles, and they draw little lines and arrows going to people who would have what's also now, you may be reading some other courses, called networks. The idea of networks connecting these are measures of power. And this is a continuing residue in the network analysis, which is still considered important among many sociologists, political scientists. John Patchett is one of the leaders on this campus. Ed Lauman, who recently retired, Ed Lauman, John Patchett, Ron Burt in the business school. These are some of the top people in the world dealing with networks. And a lot of it's mathematical, and they build these things with sophisticated means. But the core idea, I'll just mention in terms of those of you who have a more of an economics background, Harrison White, who was a key guy who trained several of these people at Harvard, was a physicist, a PhD in physics and training. He nevertheless said, let's use networks. This is hot stuff. So for 20 years or so, a lot of Harvard students learned about networks. Then he somehow got linked with the Harvard Business School, and he learned more about markets. And so when Harrison White came here 10 years or so ago with John Patchett sitting in the front, I've forgotten if I'd asked a question or not, but John Patchett asked a question and said, you know, you really haven't talked about networks at the end of the lecture. And Harrison White said, John, are you still working on networks? Okay, so I'm pointing to these silly little things in the sense, they're not just, yes, in part they're fads, but it's not just fads. I mean, these are very smart people. They spend their whole careers doing these kinds of things. And so, Hunter continued the Marxist legacy. And the type of leader, not only when I say elite, the key elite he identified how? Business and top profession, certain kinds of people who work in banks, big like banks and maybe developers, business developers. These are the kinds of people who are seen as, yeah, move over there if you want, if you're cold, or we close it a little bit.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, you're okay? Okay, so the business of this then led to, and so I came into this field, they were between 1945 and, so it was 1952 was the 53 was Hunter's book. Between 53 and the 70s, there were about got my number here, around 180 case studies, 180 studies, and they followed Hunter's approach, and they had the same results and the same findings, business dominated American cities, and business dominated the economy, and business had power over us. Okay, that was a very widespread view. And just for example, a guy who wrote some more, who wrote two or three of the most widely read books was C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills was called The Power Elite. Power Elite. And he said the U.S. Congress that we're talking about today, because it's in the headlines, he said they don't matter. They're not top institutions. The only things that really matter in America are the president, the military, and the top corporate structure. And the term he began to use was the corporate, the corporate, what's the term? I'm blocking on the term. And there were two terms that are widely used. He used his in contrast to, okay. Most important in terms of this literature, it's Hunter's title, which he gave his title gave the whole field the name, and it was called Community Power Structure. That was his book. Okay. Dahl, as you can see, if you dabble a little bit on the Who Governs book, he began. I mean, he was considered generally the top political scientist in the world. Brilliant guy at Yale, and he trained, for example, others that we'll talk about, but one that we've talked about is Putnam, Robert Putnam, is a top political scientist now. He's not as good as Dahl, but he's still very good. And okay, 1961, or early, just before 61, when they published the book, he had some very smart research assistants whose names I have down here. The Linds led to the Hunter. This in turn led to Dahl, and three assistants were Nelson Polsby, Raymond Wolfinger, and Aaron Wildowski. These three guys all worked with him for several years, and then continued on. Were major, mostly two of them were at Berkeley for most of their career. Wolfinger went to Stanford, I think. Anyway, they're in the Bay Area. And the point is, they had a very aggressive style, attacking the Hunter people and saying, you're Marxist, you're talking about all of it, the U.S. That's too simplistic. And that political scientists said, we want something more complicated, more subtle. And so they did what they did, as did Hunter. Let's study our own mayor in New Haven. And you read a little bit about him, named Richard Lee. And Dahl really generalized in part from him, but he didn't just generalize. He wrote a brilliant book introducing new concepts. I mean, he'd written earlier, he'd written a very academic book with Harold Lasswell called The Concept of Power. So, and it's very abstract. Nobody read it, and so he wanted to write a more widely used textbook for political science to teach kids how democracy works and so forth. And so, Who Governs is the result. And as I mentioned, I did the bike tour with Mark Hansen. He was dean of the social science division for 10 or 15 years. Before that, he was a professor here in political science. He went to Harvard for five or eight years, and then he was unhappy with the way Harvard people were doing political science anymore. So he came back to Chicago, and he's now a provost working at. But the point I'm making is, he says in the book Bike Ride, I would reread Who Governs once a year to see how to do this well. Once a year. I mean, he's a top political scientist, rereads this book again and again. So you can do it as well, but my point is, it's subtle. You've got to dig out those concepts. So we had them on the board, and we wrote down some of them, and there were a little bit on the exam. Okay. So some of them are here. Pluralistic, political leadership, resources. And so in the readings, anybody glance at some of the readings in this section? You want to, anything else that we said about? Well, okay, let me get through these four, and then we. Okay, so that's the third main tradition: pluralism, political leadership, not business dominance, and each of these transformed the tradition. But we will add. Anybody remember in Who Governs? How did Dahl deal with history? How did he deal with the 19th century in New Haven?
Can you specify what you mean by that?
What kind of methodology, what kind of data did he look at? How did he say that there's pluralism in 19th century in New Haven? And how did it come or go? How did it change over the 19th century and into the 20th?
Field work he did. It was like field work that he did in New Haven, right? Like observing and then going through historical records.
But he was the book was written and published in the 1960s. He couldn't do that for the 1890s or 1860s. What did he do? He did the same things that people did in the first column. He used positional data. He looked at the members of the New Haven City Council, and he classified them in terms of ethnic background, and he basically, his story was these were white Protestants, Anglo-Saxons in background, and this was their appearance, this was their way that they may not have talked that much, but when the immigrants arrived, that is in 1800, they didn't talk about it as WAPs. They were just people, New Haven residents. Everybody was the same, more or less. But the middle of the 19th century, in cities like New York, Boston, New Haven, you had a massive number of immigrants from Eastern Europe, Poland, Italy, Spain. Then with the pogroms, they had smart Russian Jews and so forth. These immigrants, and then they organized, except with the last group I mentioned, they organized around the Roman Catholic Church. And the Democratic Party and the Roman Catholic Church fought and destroyed the leadership of the WASP in these cities and across, let's say especially these cities, because they were the oldest, biggest American cities, and they were a model for the traditions. When you get further west, these were newer cities, and they did not have the degree to which they had. That is, California, LA didn't exist until around 1890, essentially. Okay, so and Chicago didn't exist after about 1850, 1860, whatever. I mean, then Chicago was the second city in the U.S., and it took off very, very fast. So that was the model that the French were saying, you know, how can they do this in Chicago? They've got the city's booming. All right. So, nevertheless, Dahl did not compare. He didn't say why and how is New Haven different from Atlanta. He basically said that let me qualify. He, and especially his students who wrote the nasty journal articles, Dahl was always a gentleman, always a gentleman. But these young assistants, publishers, you know, Hunter doesn't know what he's doing. He's stupid. He's doing the wrong things. He has the wrong methodology. And if you can't build, all you're doing, and you have 150 papers that do the same thing, it's just like buying 150 copies of the New York Times and comparing the same New York Times to each other, and then saying that's the news. That's a phrase which they used several times. Okay, so his point is, this is a reputation only, which you read about in the newspaper. But what you should be doing, and what was the methodology of Dahl? I heard you loosely say he talked to people, but what were the questions? How did you do that when you were just talking? I gave you one answer from Hunter. He had networks, he had drew arrows, circles, lines, and so forth. What did Dahl do? The answer is really who governs. But what they asked, I'm looking down here below. I'll go back and forth on the two columns. The last one's the comparative. I came into this field at this point and did a paper which is there's a chapter in the book which you can glance at called, the book is Community Structure and Decision Making on the syllabus. But the first chapter was abbreviated here. Who governs, where, when, and with what effects? That is, in changing the questions, going beyond who governs, we want to say, if we want to understand power and coordination, leadership, all these things, we also need to look at where, when, and with what effects. That is, when we say where and when, we want to compare cities. We want to compare issue areas. We want to compare effects. When we talk about effects, budgets, who spends more money or less money? Which ones have welfare or not? And why? Why do you have these different major policies? Why do we have, okay, that's it. So the answer, and this is why I'm going back and forth here, is what we then said, let's use all the methodologies of the three previous traditions, not just one. Let's use them all and compare them in different cities. And, well, I came to Chicago, and they had the National Opinion Research Center. Peter Rossi was the director. He was really interested in community power. And so Bob Crane came from Johns Hopkins, and the three of us started together what was called the Permanent Community Sample. So instead of having one city, we took the sampling points for the national surveys, and we got initially it was 51 cities. So we had a sample of 51 cities nationally representative of the U.S. population, which nobody talked about, like Hunter and Dahl before that. Okay, so then we said let's use methods that you can seriously monitor, and people can check us up if we do it right or wrong. Initially, we wanted to use the interviewers for the NFR-NORC, but then initially we were going to use urban politics experts and have them go out and do what they did and ask the same questions. But we tried to do it. We did a pre-test. We found these people kept changing the questions in ways that made it fit with their theory, or they changed the words, or so we said, hey, wait a minute, we don't trust these people to do it comparably in ways that someone else could replicate and get the same answer. If you can't replicate and get the same answer, you're not doing science. Okay, we wanted to do science. So we used the professional interviewers who didn't know anything about community power, but we gave them a questionnaire and said, just ask the questions. And the first one was, you know, who holds certain resources, or in terms of the decision, who favored a policy, who supported, who opposed, who mediated, and who prevailed. Those were the basic 5 questions that we asked. And then we combined it with the brilliant insight of Dahl was to study his concept, issue areas. Don't study one thing. That is, Hunter didn't mention issue area. Hunter just said, who's powerful in Atlanta? We want to say, who's powerful, or that is, who are the issues? And then we repeated the same issues as Dahl had used: education, mayoral elections, school board, and then we added 1 or 2 more. We added the environment and budgets. I think maybe that was later on. Okay, so that is, it was issue specific, and it was replicable, and we had 3 versions of them: OERP, CERP, and DEC right there in the middle. Okay, OERP is the open-ended reputational approach, where we said, you know, that we asked the questions that I mentioned: who supported, who mediated, who and then the question, the interviewer would just write down the answers, or they should have, just verbatim when you ask these things. The closed-end version would give them a list of people such as business, bankers, developers, traditional families, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, African Americans, poor people. I mean, we give them a long list of different potential participants, neighborhood associations, churches, Roman Catholic Church, etc. And that was the closed-end reputational. It was a totally consistent list in every one of the 51 cities. Finally, we asked these decisional questions, which were closer to Dahl, but we then could compare the open-ended decisional questions with the closed-ended and the 2 forms of those. So we could then see, we could check consistency among the methodologies to see, because the nasty students of Dahl were saying, Hunter's just, he's making up these results because it's just a product of his methodology. And what he found was they were wrong. That is, how did we know it was wrong? We did, initially, I don't want to go into too many details, but basically, we compared the 3 results, and if we were in a city like Waco, Texas, or Fort Worth, Texas, when this was first done, we found everybody said, using all 3 methods, there's a business elite. These business leaders are very strong. They make a big difference. In that sense, it fits with Hunter in terms of results, but it doesn't matter if you use Dahl's or Hunter's questions. If you really have a business elite, people will tell it to you. Maybe, if you ask it at least in these 3 different ways, or 4 different ways as well, which could be, say, members of what proportion of the city council are business and background. Okay. So what we did was so this is more the methodology and the data, but what is here in the chapters that are in the reading list are the concepts. What's the conceptual framework? And the first one was who governs where, when, and with what effects. I then have, I'll let you, I was going to do a PowerPoint, but I'll let you look it up. It looks like this. This looks very similar to what you've seen before in the new political culture. They've seen in the scenescapes. And I'll even add, I wrote a draft of this as a second-year graduate student. So I haven't, in that sense, I haven't changed very much. But I was trying to add context. I didn't use the term scene, but what we're adding is the context. and we're seeing the same kind of critique and getting different answers by building on the best work of smart people working on already. But if you say, well, if you got three smart people and they're all doing different things and they get conflicting results, what can we do? So one thing I had, and it's not on the reading list, but the last chapter was called the comparative study of community decision making. I said we should create a committee that talks about how can we do this so that people will talk to each other, so they'll not just shout at each other and criticize. Why don't we try to be scientists together? And that is happening. And so the biggest example is there are 800,000 people who are now using this in China and talking about in these terms. And they're not doing it just for research. They're doing it because they want to make cities work better in China and to build on the best examples from Paris and from Berlin and Rome, but use them in the new cities of China in ways that can make more of a difference in a positive way. And they're being, because in part they've got lots of money, they're growing very fast, and they're open. They don't have 1,000 years of Roman history on their shoulders. They're building, and they're using the arts and aesthetics and consumers a lot more actively than people are in the rest of the world. Okay, so here's the framework. Take a look. What I'm holding this up to you for is to say each of these chapters, I'm teasing you a little bit, there's one or two key pictures that tells you the main story of the chapter. So the little sections, that was the first one, here's the second one. This is called, here's the title I called Resources by What? Question mark. And what we have here is down the side on the left are, of other things, Dahl's resources, exactly his list. The same list of listing included votes, money and credit, control over jobs, control of these kinds of things. Across the top, we have the same things. So we have a matrix, same things on the top and on the side. And so the question which it then fills up the information is, we have symbols, meaning, and score, 1, 2, 3. Or yeah, okay, so we can score them and give them numbers in ways that can be compared quantitatively. Okay, so the next section and the new contribution is to say, okay, let's now have down here the same list of Dahl, and as you see, I deliberately was using Dahl's list to say that we can build on that. That's a very good creative idea. These are only resources, but what we're asking in these matrices is, where can we convert these resources into something else? And so Hunter talked about this power. Dahl said this is influence. So influence was a different term that Dahl was using there. And so we said, if we want to convert the resources into influence, what do we have to do, and how? And if so, the Dahl answer, simple answers, you need more resources. The question is, how do you use the resources to make a difference? And that's what we show here. And so the question I asked was, who governs where, when, with what effects? That is, where do you have an impact in terms of policies? And so you have a more journalistic answer from Dahl and Polsby and Wolfinger, but we were looking for a more systematic way that we could compare and have other people in other countries and other cities over time. And so over the decades thereafter, we have over 10,000. We have over 10,000 cities in 35 countries where people have done this now. It's called the Fiscal Austerity and Urban Innovation Project, FAUI. 10,000 cities, 35 countries. People have done things like this in ways that we can then look as well at the cases and fit the cases into a quantitative framework. Okay, so how can we do that? Building one step at a time, and I would say this was a good idea. I thought it was invented. I thought it was a good idea for me. I then found almost simultaneously James Coleman, who was here in sociology, and Art Stinchcomb had been at Berkeley, and then he came to Chicago a little right after that. All three of us had almost the same kind of ideas. So it's saying, if a field has, a potential for a good idea, maybe you won't be the only one. But there are ways that one could try to put these things together. And so what this did was what I showed with examples: prestige value, institutionalized importance, power value, and index of general applicability. So that's 4 different columns for 4 different contexts. And deliberately I chose the context because we wanted to choose contexts that would be analytically, and we didn't want to just say the mayor's election. That's not a, we want to generalize. Why do we have and so the Paul Schumacher paper, he has maybe 50 contexts. But how do you analytically define an important difference? In the same way, if you want to build GNP, want to build the economy, want to model the economy, what kind of sectors of the economic sector do you want to analyze and be able to compare? So you need a theory with concepts which are generalizable. And if you just have the name of an area like mayoral election or Atlanta, that's not science. It's not social science. Not any kind of science. Okay, so these kinds of ideas would link to, for instance, institutionalized importance. What's that? What's that? Maybe that doesn't mean anybody with. Does that mean okay? Give me the quick answer. Institutionalized means they're clear values like the Roman law. Whereas in the English and American continuation, and especially if we have trust in decline, I'll throw that out as you've heard it a little bit already. Putnam, Lipset, the New York Times people are talking about in the U.S. House of Representatives, in Chicago, we have 4 branches of the city council, and they don't want to talk to each other. You've got to, when we're talking about lots of countries around the world, it's a lot more complicated than it was just 10 or 20 or 50 years ago. And many of the models don't work. Now, it's not that they're dead. All these things still have elements that are still there, but they're changing in many ways very fast, even in France, even in China. Okay. Let me put there, and let's have a little bit of discussion. 8 minutes. We had 5 French teams we were working with, and each of the 5 teams refused to talk to each other. They were non-speaking terms, to try to have them build a questionnaire they would use in French. We thought we'd just adapt, just translate the same questionnaire we use in Canada and Japan, the French. Oh no, we got to do it for France. And each of the 5 teams had a different way to do it. And they would fight, and then they'd call me up. We didn't have any internet then. They'd call me up. I'd talk by phone to each of the 5 French teams. Say, well, how can we have a compromise? How can you somehow get anybody?
Sorry, why were they not on speaking terms?
Because of ideological, methodological, personality differences for the same reasons that you and probably your dormitory friends don't agree on what kind of food to order or who to vote for. Or in the U.S. House of Representatives, people are different, and I guess the difference is we have more democracy, more individualism, more education. People are more aware of their ideological and political differences, especially at a smart university like you, and especially if you come from a place like Chicago, where people are interested, and France. I mean, the French elites and the Chicago elites talk a lot about politics. And so in France, they talk in much more explicitly abstract ideology terms. In the U.S. and in Chicago, they don't. It's much more implicit. And so you've got to say, wow, you have to read a book like Don't make no waves, don't back no losers. That's the title of Chicago. Rules of the machine's game. Rules of the game. Don't make no waves, don't back no losers. Compare that to the French, you know, Roman law, legal code. But the point is, that's why they taught, why sociologists here, some of them will say, we have to do ethno-methodology. You have to talk to each person because they're different. It's true. Logically, each person is unique. But the point is, if you want to somehow generalize and build a theory, you can't just say everything is unique. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think like that hierarchy, especially in the schools now, has been shifting away from that ideas. Even if you take those grandes écoles, they're starting to look a lot more like the US in their application process, except they don't know how to handle it, which makes it even worse. But that idea of passing an exam has become a lot less significant than it was 10 years ago. And also the actual exam, a lot of like the 45 plus years old people will tell you, oh well, it's gotten so easy. But yeah, the grades have increased, but the requirements to get into those programs in France have also increased. And I think you're talking about ego and arrogance, and especially based on age, how many of the adults who have passed the baccalaureate a long time ago keep saying, oh well, now it's a lot more easy because the grades are higher, except the criteria to enter into the different schools have gone up as well. So the arrogance also applies, I think, generationally.
Yes. I mean, I was a student. I did my PhD on the French university because it was complicated. It was so tricky for me to figure out, what to study. And it was enough of a puzzle. It was interesting enough. I said, hey, this is worth studying. Okay, so I did a PhD on it. So then I published that. I published there after I published the book in, I think it was 1973 and 1987. I taught the Sorbonne. I taught in the same building, same room, same classroom, same name of the course. It was totally different because the students had totally changed. So in 1973, every one of the students, there may have been only 6, was very small. They talked and wrote like Jean-Paul Sartre. They were literary, they were polished, they were very smart, and they had very smart things to say. Second time I taught there, 1/3 of the students sat in the back. They read newspapers and chewed gum. They didn't listen to anything I was saying, and I'd ask them a question. They say, could you repeat the question, please? It had become mass education in a massive way that Bourdieu would write about. And so this is why Bourdieu was studying the same kind of stuff, but we had different ways of interpreting what was going on. Okay. Other hands. Comments. How does this fit or not fit with your school experiences this year? You've heard some dramatic extremes. Where'd you go to school?
Before this?
Yes.
I went to high school in Montreal, and then I went to a boarding school in Connecticut for a few years before I got here.
What school?
Hotchkiss School.
Okay. These are top elite. If you don't all know, top elite private schools, and so in Montreal, you probably went to a pretty good version of what was the lycée.
No, I didn't go to a French school actually. I was in an English community then.
Oh, okay. Okay. No, that's all the more interesting. So you were English speaker within Montreal.
Yes. Well, elementary was kind of a weird school. Like elementary school was mostly French, and then when we went into middle school and high school, we had certain language requirements. Some courses had to be taught in French. For example, history. We have like federal exams, that sort of thing.
Okay. I mean, so again, that's a great case to be able to try to be more culturally sensitive to the differences between England and France, was being a minority within Montreal.
Yeah.
I've been to many meetings in Montreal. They still have meetings of the French Association of No, the Sociological Association of French-Speaking Sociologists. And so you have, 200, they get all the jets and they fly in these top intellectuals, professors and so forth. They go to Montreal usually, and then talk with the Belgians, the Swiss, the French Canadians, and I'm the only person who goes there. But it's a good way to see this and to have arguments and learn from the Parisians, because it's damn hard to get any time in Paris. But when you're that kind of context, you can all have breakfast, lunch, and dinner with each other. It's good. Okay. Let's see, we are at the end. We will continue Wednesday and
Monday.
sorry.
Monday.
What day is today? Well, today's, I'm sorry, okay, so Monday. And so normally we'll have office hours next Monday, but if there's something quick, stop by right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for you adding context. Talk to your friends in dormitory or others. Talk to you about your high school backgrounds and how your experiences were similar and different. It's an excellent way to really learn with this diverse student body here.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.